The little girl followed the little pony. One morning, what she found in the canyon changed everything. Red Rock, Wyoming Territory, early spring of 1883. The frost had not yet lifted from the ground and the sun was just a pale smear behind the eastern hills. The frost had not yet lifted from the ground, and the sun was just a pale smear behind the eastern hills. Sarah Collins knelt in the thin grass by the south fence, a hammer in her hand, pressing a warped board back into place. Her gloves were worn at the fingertips, her nails cold in her pocket. Every post she repaired was another day this fence might keep the animals where they belonged. Mama! The pony's running to the canyon. Sarah's head jerked up. She spotted Emily by the barn, her small hands pointing toward the far pasture. Stay here, Emily. It's too dangerous, Sarah called out, her voice sharp with worry. But I can catch him. Emily's words were small, hesitant. But before Sarah could say another thing, the little girl spun and darted off, her boots kicking up puffs of frostbitten grass. Emily! Sarah dropped the hammer and ran, her skirt snagging on a low splinter of fence as she scrambled over the rise. Buttercup, their golden pony, was moving at an easy trot ahead of Emily, his tail swishing lazily. The rope from his halter trailed in the dirt, and he followed the narrow path toward the canyon. Sarah's chest tightened. That canyon was trouble. Steep drops, loose stones, and cracks in the earth deep enough to swallow a man. Her husband had told her once that a single misstep there could end a life. By the time she caught sight of Emily again, the child was already halfway down the trail into the canyon, her short legs quick and determined. Buttercup had vanished around a bend. Emily, stop right now. Sarah's voice echoed off the canyon walls. But the little girl didn't turn. When Sarah rounded the bend herself, she found Emily crouched in the dust, not looking at the pony at all. Buttercup stood a few paces away, his head lowered, sniffing at something lying in the shadow of a rock outcrop. It was a man. He lay on his side, his coat torn at the shoulder, a dark stain spreading across the leather. One leg was bent at an unnatural angle, and there was a deep gash on his forehead. Nearby, the shredded remains of a saddle lay in the dirt, the stirrup leather sliced clean. Drops of blood led up the trail, mixed with the sharp gouges of hooves as if there had been a struggle. Emily looked up. Mama, he's hurt bad. He won't wake up. Sarah knelt quickly, brushing dust from his cheek. His skin was cold, but there was a pulse, faint but steady. His face, though streaked with blood, was strong-boned beneath the stubble. Whoever he was, he hadn't been here long. We have to help him, Emily said, her voice small but certain. Sarah glanced around. No other rider. No sign of whoever had done this. The canyon was silent except for the distant call of a hawk. Emily tugged at the strap of her little canteen, the one she used when she chased Buttercup in the yard. She unscrewed it with both hands and tipped it toward the man's lips. Emily, that's... Sarah began, but stopped as she saw the water trickle into his mouth. His throat worked in a shallow swallow. He's thirsty, Emily whispered, though Sarah could see her own lips were dry and cracked. Sarah took a slow breath, then slipped her shawl from her shoulders and draped it over the man, tucking it around his sides to hold in the meager warmth. The wind carried the smell of dust and sage, sharp in her nose. Come on, sweetheart, she said quietly. We're taking him home. Buttercup flicked his ears as if understanding, and Sarah began to figure out how to move an unconscious man out of a canyon with nothing but a rope, a pony, and the stubborn will that had kept her and Emily alive these past 2 years. The canyon wind cut sharp and cold as Sarah dropped to her knees beside Emily. The little girl was sitting in the dust, her tiny hand resting on the arm of a man sprawled half in shadow. He looked to be in his mid-30s, broad-shouldered under a weather-worn leather coat, now darkened with blood at the shoulder and across his temple. He's hurt bad, Sarah said quickly, her eyes sweeping over him. Emily shook her head. He woke up for a second, then closed his eyes again. Sarah pressed 2 fingers to his neck. A pulse weak but there. Her first instinct was to run for help, to fetch Sheriff Talbot, or anyone from town who could deal with an unconscious stranger. She didn't know this man. He could be trouble. Then his eyelids fluttered, and for the briefest moment his gaze met hers. There was no threat in it, only a raw, wordless plea. Something in that faint, desperate look made her pause. "All right?" she muttered under her breath. "We're not leaving you here." She glanced up the slope they had come down. The path was narrow, scattered with loose shale. Getting him out would be hard, but leaving him meant he might not survive another hour. "Emily, get the rope from Buttercup's saddle," she instructed. The little girl scrambled to obey. Sarah looped the rope carefully under the man's arms, wincing as he groaned faintly. She anchored it to Buttercup's small but sturdy frame, then took the lead herself, pulling while the pony stepped forward. Inch by inch, they dragged him up the slope, Sarah digging her heels into the dirt for leverage. Emily tugged alongside her with all the strength her small body could muster. By the time they reached the rim of the canyon, Sarah's arms burned, her breath sharp in her chest. Buttercup stood panting, his ears flicking nervously. "Just a bit more," she told Emily, and together they managed to half-carry, half-drag the man toward the house. Inside, she cleared the table with one sweep of her arm and lowered him onto it. His head lolled to one side, a fresh streak of blood staining her sleeve. "Emily, bring the clean rags from the shelf," Sarah said, reaching for the basin. She poured water from the kettle, the steam curling into the cold room. With quick, practiced movements, she cleaned the wound at his temple, then tore a strip from an old sheet to bind it. The shoulder wound was deeper. She packed it with cloth and tied it tight. As she worked, her hand brushed against something under his coat. She reached in and drew out a small worn leather pouch. The initials JD were pressed into the flap. Beneath it, tucked into an inner pocket, was an old silver badge, dulled with age, but still bearing the engraving of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. She stared at it for a moment. That badge marked a man of means, someone who owned cattle in large numbers, maybe hundreds of head. What was a man like that doing injured and alone in a canyon? The man stirred, his lips moving. Sarah leaned closer. "They took the herd, and my horse." The words were barely more than a breath before he slipped back into unconsciousness. Sarah straightened slowly, her mind working. Whoever this man was, trouble had found him. And now, whether she liked it or not, he was lying in her kitchen, and his trouble might not be far behind. The smell of wood smoke and strong coffee lingered in the small kitchen, weaving through the worn wooden beams and settling into the corners of the room like an old friend. Sarah was tending the stove when a low groan caught her attention. She turned just in time to see the stranger's eyelids flutter open, revealing eyes heavy with pain and confusion. His gaze slowly swept across the cramped space before resting on her. Then, as if drawn by some silent signal, it shifted to Emily, who sat cross-legged on the floor, gently brushing Buttercup's coat with a careful hand. "Where am I?" His voice was rough, scraped raw by thirst and exhaustion. "You're in my home," Sarah said calmly, "near Red Rock, Wyoming." He shifted slightly, wincing as the movement tugged at the bandage wrapped around his shoulder. "I'm John Dawson," he managed. "I owned the Triple Ridge Ranch about 30 miles east of here." Sarah's brow furrowed in surprise. "That's a long way from this canyon." John's jaw clenched with quiet frustration. "I was driving a small string of bloodstock into town when they came out of nowhere. Masked men armed to the teeth. Took the horses, the gear, everything. Left me for dead." Emily's wide eyes looked up at him curiously. "Bad men." John's lips curled into a faint, weary smile, despite the pain etched across his face. "The worst kind." Sarah crossed her arms, her mind racing with conflicting thoughts. A man like this, wealthy enough to own a large ranch, could bring danger right to her doorstep. Red Rock was a small community. Word of his presence would spread quickly, and that could mean trouble. "You should be in a doctor's care," she said cautiously. "Or at least at the sheriff's office." John shook his head stubbornly. "I need to be on the trail. Every hour I'm laid up, they get farther away. I can't let them disappear into the hills." He swung one leg off the table he had been resting on, attempting to push himself upright. The effort drained the color from his face, and he sagged back slightly. Sarah moved quickly, placing her firm hands on his good shoulder to steady him. "You're in no shape to ride." From the floor, Emily piped up with surprising clarity for her age. "You can't chase bad men if you can't even sit up." John glanced down at the little girl, blinking in surprise as she held out a small piece of dry bread from her plate. "Here. Mama says, food makes you strong." His eyes softened in gratitude, and for a moment, some of the tension eased from his face. He accepted the bread slowly, savoring it as if it were a feast. Sarah let the silence linger before she spoke again. "You'll stay here until you're steady enough to stand without falling over. A few days at least." John's voice was laced with reluctance, but the edge was gone. "I don't like being grounded," he admitted. "On one condition: no one in town hears about me. Not the sheriff, not the storekeeper, no one." Sarah studied him, curiosity sharpening her tone. "Why? If they think I'm still breathing, they'll come looking to finish the job," he explained quietly. "I'd rather they believe their work is done." After a long moment, Sarah nodded firmly. "Fine. You'll recover here. But understand, my daughter and I keep to ourselves. I won't have trouble spilling over into our lives." John met her gaze steadily, respect shining through his weariness. "I don't plan to bring you trouble, Mrs. Collins." "Mrs. Collins," he repeated, inclining his head in acknowledgement. "Then it's a deal." Emily smiled brightly at the exchange, clearly pleased with her role in keeping the stranger from riding off half-dead. Sarah, however, kept her thoughts guarded, wondering what kind of man could lose everything in a canyon and still carry such quiet resolve in his eyes. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Sarah had not expected. "Have to carry that alone anymore?" he said quietly, the sincerity in his voice wrapping around her like a protective blanket. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the walls Sarah had built around her heart began to crumble, not as barriers, but as foundations for something new, something stronger. The heat of the fire inside the cabin seemed to ignite a warmth within her chest that she hadn't felt in years. Without a word, John leaned in, his breath mingling softly with hers. The roughness of his beard grazed her cheek as their faces drew closer, a tender connection sparking between them. Sarah's hand rose instinctively to his neck, her fingers curling into the worn leather of his coat, grounding herself in the quiet intimacy of the moment. Their lips met in a gentle, hesitant touch, the first question in a silent conversation, the first answer to long, unspoken hopes. The flickering flames caught the sparkle in their eyes, highlighting the unspoken promises and fragile beginnings of trust. When they finally parted, Sarah rested her forehead against John's, the world outside shrinking until all that remained was the crackle of the fire and the steady rhythm of two hearts learning to heal and to believe again. From that night forward, the line between stranger and savior blurred into something deeper and more profound. No longer bound merely by gratitude or circumstance, they began to build a family, growing stronger with each passing day. Together, they crafted a home not just of wood and stone, but of shared hopes, renewed dreams, and the kind of love born in the quiet moments after a storm. The morning sun spilled golden light over the Dawson Ranch, its warm rays stretching long and lazy across the rolling fields and weathered barns. The gentle breeze carried the fresh scent of pine and earth, rustling through the tall grasses and whispering promises of new beginnings. Sarah stood on the worn wooden porch, her eyes tracing the familiar contours of the land she had called home for years. But today, beneath that familiar sky, the landscape seemed different, full of hope, brimming with possibilities she had not dared to imagine before. John stood quietly beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. Without a word, his hand found hers, fingers wrapping gently around hers, conveying a certainty and comfort that needed no spoken promise. "I want you both to come live with me," John said softly, his voice steady and sure, like the earth beneath their feet. "This ranch is bigger than I can manage alone." Sarah, I want you to have full say over the house, your decisions, your space. Emily will have room to run and grow, and Buttercup will be right where he belongs, right here with us. Sarah's eyes brimmed with tears, tears that held the weight of relief, joy, and gratitude all at once. She lowered her gaze to see Emily bouncing on the balls of her feet nearby, her wild curls tossing in the morning breeze, a bright smile lighting up her small face. At the sight of Buttercup tethered close by, Emily's excitement burst forth like sunshine itself. "We're going to live with Mr. John," Emily shouted with pure delight, her little arms wrapping tightly around the pony's neck. Buttercup neighed softly in response, as if understanding every word, sharing in the happiness of this momentous day. John's smile softened as he watched the fearless little girl who had changed everything with her boundless trust and unshakable spirit. "Welcome to the family," he said, his voice gentle and full of meaning. Days turned into weeks, and the trio settled into a rhythm that felt both new and perfectly natural. The house hummed with laughter and lively conversation. The kitchen was often filled with the aroma of fresh bread and hearty stews, the result of shared meals and shared efforts. Sarah's garden, once sparse and struggling, now flourished under her careful hands and Emily's eager help, bursting with vegetables and flowers that brightened the homestead. The ranch itself thrived under the combined care and expertise of John and Sarah. Fences were repaired, pastures tended, and cattle managed with a renewed vigor that promised a prosperous future. The shadows of past hardships and dangers, once looming so large, now felt distant and softened by the strength of their unity and the love growing quietly between them. One evening, as the sun dipped low toward the horizon, painting the sky in breathtaking shades of amber, rose, and lavender, the three rode out together. Buttercup led the way, trotting with spirited energy ahead of them. Sarah felt the familiar weight of John's hand gently slipping into hers, his fingers curling around hers in a silent promise. A promise of partnership, protection, and shared dreams. They rode along a ridge that overlooked the valley below, the air crisp and scented with pine needles and fresh earth. Emily's joyful laughter floated back to them as she encouraged Buttercup to quicken his pace, her small voice filled with delight and the freedom only a child could know. John glanced over at Sarah, the last rays of the setting sun catching the depth in his eyes. No words were spoken, but the love they had found in each other spoke louder than any declaration could. It was a love born not just from kindness, but from courage and the unexpected turns of fate. A love that had transformed strangers into family, hardship into hope. Together, beneath the vast and endless Wyoming sky, they rode toward a future bright with promise. The bonds they had forged, tempered by trials and strengthened through trust, stood firm, stronger than any storm that might come their way, unshakable as the mountains themselves.